Good morning and welcome to another edition of the Debrief here on FingerLakes1.com. It's the middle of the week. We're about 6 days away from Christmas, I think, if math is still working in my head. But there has been so much going on in the news over the last few weeks. Obviously, it's been a while since I've been joined by Jackie Augustine, but she's here.
I'm here.
And we're here. God, there have been so many interesting news. Going through trying to come up with the list of things that we were going to talk about today was so hard because there's probably about 15 things we could talk about, but we only have time probably to reasonably talk about 5 or 6.
Yes, I think you're probably right about that.
So a couple quick notes. We had talked earlier in the month, and I think in November as well, about Leslie Danks-Burke joining us on the program. She is coming. She will be here. Obviously, not right this second, obviously.
Nope.
January 11th looks like the day we're going. That's a Friday. It's the second Friday of the month, the new year even. And that'll be happening.
A great way to start the new year.
It really will be, because that will definitely be a government-focused show.
Yes.
And sort of government function.
And hopefully people know about the Trailblazers pack that she has formed and kind of the work that they're doing. But we will explore that in more detail so that people can understand what they're doing on a local government.
Yeah, and actually there's a couple reference shows that I'll throw up. She's been on my podcast two or three times, one of the two. And we've talked in depth about sort of how Trailblazers formed and what function it serves now and how that's sort of changed. It's really interesting what they're doing. They are doing some good work on the local government side, which is really kind of missing, especially on the educational piece. We will have 2 new episodes coming up after this episode before the end of the year. So don't worry, this won't be the last episode of the Debrief. I'll be joined by Ted Baker on an episode that'll air Christmas Eve morning. And then also we will have an episode at the end of the week, next week, on Friday during our normal time slot around 9:30, talking about the year-end review. I think that'll be sort of our year-end review episode.
Well, I hope Ted wears a Christmas shirt or sweater. I will have to send him a little note about that, because
I'm sure he will.
I came ready. I'm decking the halls today.
I see that, and I'm thoroughly impressed, because this is so. You know what? You teed that up perfectly. We're going to start with probably the most controversial topic we could start with.
Okay.
Let's talk about Baby It's Cold Outside.
Oh, no. All right.
Yeah, let's do it. We're going to do that. So I wrote a column. It was in the Finger Lakes Times yesterday about this topic, Tuesday, if you're watching us later in the week. Obviously, some radio stations have banned the song. Some radio stations have had to back away from that move to ban, and it's been reinstated. There's a lot of conversation around it right now. Whether it fits in the Me Too era, whether it's appropriate, what the sort of implications are of the song. Before I go on a 5-minute rant, what is your sort of feeling or takeaway from this whole discussion or conversation?
Well, I have to admit I haven't really been participating in it, but I did read your column, and I thought it was well done, because I agree with you that if the reason we would start censoring stuff is because the content is objectionable in terms of lyrics and what images are being conjured up, that really does open the door for censoring a lot of mainstream media right now. A lot of music, a lot of games, television shows. And while I may not like that material myself, I agree with you overall that within reason, keeping things circulating in the public domain prompts conversation and discussion. And I hope that people are using these particular items as a way of talking through some of these issues. I don't agree that just shutting things down is necessarily the best solution.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So there's like, I feel like there's 2 or 3 different sort of debates around this that is happening. There's the debate around what the lyrics say. There's a debate about whether it should be presented or continue to be presented in modern culture. And then there's sort of the where do we go from here conversation with the piece that I think you're really tapping into there. If you make this exception now, what do you do with future situations? I really I focused, and I was actually kind of surprised. Evan Dawson, WXXI Connections, he weighed in on this one on Twitter a couple weeks ago, I think. And unless he's had a pretty dramatic shift in how he viewed it, his perception, and I kept seeing it on Twitter, was that it was a feminist anthem, full stop, no questions asked. And it's just interesting because so you have that debate, and I don't even want to personally get into that part of it, but I think the context of the song, and this was what I really tried to focus on yesterday in my column, was focus on the context of the song and when it was written, not now. So say I write that A column, you write columns every other week, just like I do. If you took that column and then 50 years down the road, read it as if it were written right then and there in that day, there are probably going to be pieces of it that feel either objectionable or confusing or conflated or just any number of things, because the time when it was written is as important as, I think, as the actual message of the song. And that's where it's really being derived from, I think.
Okay. I mean, I'm not sure I want to fully buy into that, because I tend to think that some things are just universally right and some things are universally wrong, and that context isn't as important in those things. However, I don't think that applies to this. So I'm not going to stake a case that that there's some universal truth contained in that song that either needs to be squelched or promoted. I don't think it's that significant. I don't particularly like that song, but I really appreciate that in your column you said we should get rid of Santa Baby, because that I find the most offensive Christmas song.
Oh my God, there are so many. Santa Baby, Grandma got run over by a reindeer.
Yeah, I mean, they're not embracing the Christmas spirit. So that, I don't know. I feel like with all the things going on in the world, I have very little bandwidth to concern myself with what that is. If it comes on and my kids are like, what's this song about? We're going to have a conversation about it. But then we're going to sing the next one that comes on. So it's just... Yeah.
And that's the other thing, too. I sort of, the image, I get the image, or I feel like some people get the image of, potentially young children who are still sort of learning, singing along to a song like this and picking up the wrong messages. And it's I don't think anybody is sitting at home singing along to this song. I just don't. Or at least not as many people as might have been 40 or 50 years ago.
Yeah, no, and if we're worried that young boys are luring women with cigarettes and alcohol on cold nights, there's a lot more we should be doing to curb that than censoring this song.
Right, and so the other part of that I wanted to talk about was that's not the only Christmas-themed item that's been sort of targeted in this kind of discussion or debate. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the movie, the claymation movie, which, by the way, those claymation movies are literally my favorite thing about Christmas.
Me too. Mm-hmm.
They're amazing. Santa Claus is Coming to Town, the Little Drummer Boy, all of them. Yeah. They're amazing. They're from the...
Let's not forget The Year Without a Santa Claus.
A Year Without a Santa Claus, The Heat Miser, and The Cold Miser. No one needs Christmas without those. But it's really interesting. So the debate there are all these really sort of dramatic undertones, bullying, homophobia. They rattled off. The Huffington Post did a really lengthy sort of, I don't want to call it an expose, but it was kind of like a debrief of this movie and all of the bad undertones that it presents. But they all coordinate, and this was sort of, it goes along with the theme of my column. They all are part of the story. That's part of the sort of triumph that happens in the story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And it's if you're wiping that, or if you're wiping every sort of negative thing from every movie or every picture that ever happens, you lose any sort of ability to tell a story, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the other reindeers were jerks. I mean, that
they were terrible.
So I think that's the message. That's the message I get when I watch it with my kids. I'm like, look at what jerks these reindeer
and the humans,
are.
The humans were terrible too.
That's the strongest language I use in my house too. So that I really mean it. But yeah, I think your column was about what I would call teachable moments, and I think that all of this media, whether it's stuff that was created long ago that we love from our childhood, or things that we're looking at right now that's being created today, we are presented with lots of teachable moments. And in general, I feel like the idea, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, kind of nothing to see here, I'm just not even going to look at it, is not the best approach. I really do think engaging, talking about it, and then putting it in... I don't want to say putting it in context because I just said some things don't belong in context. But again, within reason, I think certain objectionable content put in the right context presents you with something that is valuable for learning.
So I think about, I'm reminded of, and there were a bunch of them, but when I was in high school, controversial books, and I'm pretty sure there are a bunch that still are sort of taught in some, not in others. Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird, stories that present some, because of when they were written, because of the stories they're telling. You don't take all of it as gospel, but they're teachable. Like there are messages to be learned in those books, in these different forms of media, and you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and frankly, I think these Christmas music stations are doing us more harm by riddling our ears with commercials, which contain all of the stereotypes that we're talking about in some of these songs. I'd rather have them remove the commercials than the songs. Yeah,
and it's funny, too, because there's also that sort of, and this connects to, I think, the pushback against Christmas music coming on the radio earlier and earlier, what people feel like is earlier and earlier. It's just enjoy the season. Good Lord.
Love Christmas. I love
just
Christmas.
Enjoy it. Okay, so let's talk politics. The legislators are getting a raise. New York State legislators are getting something to the tune of...
That's what I thought you were going to lead with as the most controversial topic of the season. But
well, that may be the most controversial state topic of the last 2 decades.
Yeah.
So obviously, I believe it's about $50,000 over the span of like 2 or 3 years, right?
Yes. I mean, they're going to go up to $130,000 a year by the end of 2021. 2021 or 2022? Well, whatever. Very soon. They're going to be up at $130,000. And I agree that they should not have outside income because, as we've seen locally, we've had a lot of elected officials who do what I would call double dipping, where somehow their private business interest is enhanced by their public service, which means they're doing less of a public service than they should be. But I just don't believe people deserve a raise as of right, particularly if they are doing a poor job. And while New York is a great state, I love New York. Let me just fully buy into that marketing slogan. I mean, I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I love Geneva. I love New York. But it is not the best run state in the nation. And for our legislators to become the highest paid in the nation doesn't seem to correlate with what's really going on here. So the idea of removing outside income is one of those baby steps toward making people abide by the rules and be more ethical. But there is no substantial ethics legislation being proposed or passed. And that frustrates me because this seems to me like the shiny object is, look at, we won't take any outside money anymore. But let's ignore and overlook the fact that all of these really corrupting practices remain unchecked. And we're going to get paid more. Just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, I agree. So I actually had a few other sort of takeaways and notes. The argument that you want the best people so you have to pay them accordingly, I think is a pile of nonsense.
I agree with you.
Because I don't think you just get that. I think that is actually more applicable. That argument is more applicable on the local stage where you have town supervisors or town council people making really consequential decisions for local folks, for people who, that actually have an impact on your neighborhood, making, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000. That's not, you aren't going to get the best people doing the job at that price range.
Well, not necessarily, because let me just back up a second and say the people who would enter these jobs for the money shouldn't be entering these jobs. But I agree with you that the compensation should be commensurate with kind of the weight of the impact of the work if done correctly. But I don't necessarily think that just by offering more money, you would attract the right people.
Oh, see, I don't disagree. But the problem is that the positions become exclusive because of the pay.
Right. Oh, yes.
And that is the problem. So, maybe it's and there aren't any good numbers to actually go off of, but say 30% of the population would be fit or a good fit for a particular office, but they can't afford to make $4,000 a year, or they can't afford to live off of $10,000 a year. That, or their job won't let them sort of balance both. That is where I think it becomes more important for local offices to be properly funded, I guess.
Oh, I agree with you.
But I agree that money isn't the only thing. It's just, in my view, and this is just watching local boards, your older white, recently retired town supervisor is that because it became a workable thing for that person financially.
Well, that's funny because there was just an article, I don't remember where. I'm not claiming this idea as my own, but I can't properly source it, so I apologize. But I read an article about how unpaid internships for college-age students limits the pool to only the kids from wealthy enough households that can support having them live somewhere else and not be paid for an entire summer and not need to earn any money for their schooling for the following year. It's kind of a similar thing. When you don't pay legislators enough, you are only going to get the people who either have the time to kind of do something for virtually free, right? A lot of volunteer time, or people who just don't need the money and don't mind doing it. So that does winnow down the pool. So I agree with you there. I just want to push back against the idea that somehow if people were paid more, you would only get really good people, because no way. I
agree. I just think that is probably one of the bigger pieces to the puzzle than a lot of people give credit.
No, I agree, especially on the local level.
I listen to people talk all the time. They say they would love to serve on these boards, but they can't afford to walk away from their job or reduce their work to say 50% time or something like that.
Yeah, but I mean, let's look at it though. And in case anyone walks away from this thinking that somehow state legislators are grossly underpaid and have to have a raise because otherwise they won't be able to survive. I mean, with their base pay plus these Lulus that people get, most legislators are making $100,000 or more already. And I would argue that in New York State, maybe with the exception of a few downstate communities, that is a living wage plus.
Oh, yeah.
So we already have, at least for upstate, we have enough of an incentive that we should be getting better elected officials than we've got right now. No offense to Brian Kolb, who I always carve out as someone who I appreciate because I think his head's in the right place. But I think you look at like all of the scandals and trouble that we've had with upstate legislators, which I think we will talk about in a little bit, they're getting paid well enough to do a good job.
Yeah, and, I think there's been a lot of pushback from the legislators themselves about this, so I don't think anybody is necessarily just taking this pay raise as gospel and moving forward. I think there's going to be or continue to be a lot of discussion and debate about whether it's warranted or not.
Yeah, I mean, why can't they be creative? Why can't they say we're going to index each legislator's pay against the median income in their district? Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be a creative, sensible solution, which allows, I mean, you've got downstate legislators, I would assume, pushing for a higher rate of pay because for them, $100,000 doesn't go as far. But to say that someone who lives in Ontario or Seneca County would go to Albany and make $100,000 and somehow that's not enough does not sit well.
I guarantee you the pushback to that would be, but we're all equals. So in theory, in the two chambers, all of the legislators are equals. They all carry one vote. It isn't a weighted voted system where.
Sure.
So I think the pushback to that would be, well, hold on. Why does he, because he lives in New York City, get $20,000 more when he could be a bum and I could be a great legislator?
Yeah, but I mean, that's the old, I don't want to fall into the thing that equitable must mean equal. I think you could have equitable compensation for the Assembly and the Senate, but I sometimes think these concepts are above their pay grade.
So, all right, to that end, this won't end outside income, my humble opinion.
Yep, agreed.
If Governor Cuomo, because he will also get a nice raise out of this, had this, the Amazon deal, and some of his proposals for 2019 that have been unveiled in the last 24 to 48 hours, if those were known during the campaign, I think the outcome of the election would have been wildly different.
Really?
I do. I think it would have actually been a close race. Because you cannot, and frankly, I think any legislator or state official who is on the ballot, knowing that a $50,000 raise per human was on the docket, I think there would have been serious push. I think there just would have been an outright revolt against those folks, whether they were for it or against it, unfortunately. Because this literally feeds into the idea that elected officials are thinking about themselves. They are thinking about what most benefits them, and that is it. And Governor Cuomo ran on a very vague platform, to put it kindly. And to know that the three sort of big things that have come out since Election Day, two of them are massive pay raises and a deal that's worth something in the neighborhood of $2.5 billion. For a mega corporation like Amazon, I'm not sure that this would have been as smooth sailing for him as it became.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate part is that we know for a fact, or at least I'm going to say I know for a fact, that the Amazon deal was not born from the day after Election Day until when it was announced on the 20-something. That was known. It was there. It was always going to be released after Election Day to preserve his election.
No, I agree with you on that, yeah.
So let's talk about Geneva City Council, the retreat. You have some thoughts, ideas.
Well, I'm hoping there are some thoughts and ideas. At the last City Council meeting, they said that the minutes and the ideas that were generated would be distributed. They have not been yet, at least not to the public. But, I was, as a previous column I wrote indicated, I was distressed about their approach to the Office of Neighborhood Initiatives, beginning, of course, with the current mayor who has served on city council for what I think is like 12 years now, saying that he didn't know what the office did, despite repeated budget votes to support the office. So that was concerning. So I thought, okay, if they don't think that's the right idea, then what should be done? Every year they say, we need economic development, we need this, but they can't define what that is because clearly the Office of Neighborhood Initiatives is an economic development function. The initial neighborhood study said the metrics by which you would evaluate this would be home values, number of days on the market, amount of money people are investing in their properties. And according to all of those metrics, the program has been a success. So they want to gut a successful program and move to what? My fear is that the ideas existing in their minds are these antiquated notions of mid-'80s economic developer deal maker who comes in and does stuff which frankly ends us up with things like the Amazon deal, a very traditional tax abatement kind of thing that upon closer look, it's harder to see the actual benefits for the community that is subsidizing that project. So I'm quite concerned about that, and I'm hoping that they prove me wrong by coming out of this retreat, whenever the stuff does come out, with something new, something proven somewhere else with similar conditions that will work to keep moving Geneva ahead. Because, frankly, Geneva's made a lot of progress, but it could easily backslide if people take their eyes off the road. And frankly, that's what it seems like. Well, I don't know. They're like half asleep most of the time. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping. I hoped to be able to share some insight into that, but there is nothing publicly available yet.
So I have thoughts.
Good.
Do retreats work? That's the question I kept asking myself as I was thinking about this topic. I don't really understand what a governing body gains, or anybody for that matter, from a retreat. It sounds like a very fluffy way to sort of suggest that these big, grand organizational ideas are being thought about, when maybe that's not the case, and maybe there isn't really any substance to prove that that's actually happening. I'm also really confused about how retreats happen in terms of legality. So you have an entire board that's able to meet and discuss function without the public being there.
Well, they are technically open to the public, but as far as an announcement of the meeting or of the retreat, it was announced at a previous council meeting what dates they were looking at, but they hadn't finalized it yet. And then I do believe it was in the newspaper when they would be meeting, but I don't remember them publishing the time and place, nor specifically inviting the public. But in general, if you ask, and I'm sure the minutes will reflect, this is a special meeting, so it is open to the public.
Okay, so when people hear retreat, when the common person hears retreat, they think retreat, which means to go away.
Right, I agree.
So that fact is probably not widely known.
Yep.
And then to again, just sort of hammer down on this fact, I don't think that people need to retreat to generate good, thoughtful, meaningful ideas. I think the word retreat just sort of puts a very neat and tidy bow on an idea that it might be well intended, to have a retreat and to talk about, these big philosophical things that any community might be facing. But is that what actually happens? And I'm not looking, at this point, I'm extending well out beyond Geneva, because the city of Geneva is not the only governing body that does it. Lots of them do.
Right.
I'm just not sure it fits or it works as intended all the time.
The problem is it's the best thing that local governments have right now when you're dealing with a bunch of people who are so scared about getting reelected that they don't feel comfortable sharing their ideas during a regularly scheduled public meeting that they know people at least have a pretty good idea they're allowed to go to. So in that regard, I don't like the retreat concept, because it basically plays into that and says, okay, let's get you in a place where
let's get you in a controlled environment.
Right. So at least the minutes aren't necessarily going to be verbatim. So if you say something that you don't want anybody to know that you really feel, it won't be captured. So that part of it I don't agree with. But I do like the idea, and maybe it's because I do like these big philosophical concepts that you're not as fond of. But I think it is important that the staff get a very clear sense of what the city council wants, what they will actually support, what things they're opposed to, any ideas they might have that they want staff looking into. Because otherwise, you either have staff operating in a vacuum and being ineffective, or you have staff filling the vacuum and actually becoming the policymakers. And neither of those, from a resident's perspective, are attractive options. So you should want a really engaged council that is perpetually setting policy, making their priorities and principles known. But since most local governments don't have people that are doing that, then they have a retreat.
So I'll push back as far as to say, I'm not opposed to the philosophical ideas. I just don't believe that that's actually truly what happens, or at least not in a meaningful way. As far as I'm confused as to why they have decided to target what is now the city manager's former position. And especially given the recent history of Geneva. The DRI process showed that neighborhoods and communities within the larger community clearly want and are interested in having input. And having their voice be heard. And by eliminating this, or reducing it to halftime, I'm sort of wondering whether that will still sort of be accomplished, whether those voices will still be heard. And then also, having just gone through the Foundry cleanup process, which I think is still happening, right. I think they're coming to a close, or what seems like somewhat of a close on that one within the next year. The neighborhood aspect of that was incredibly important. As I understand, just from, and this is not from a resident's perspective, but just from reading the headlines and reading the stories, it seemed like Sage in her former capacity was a big reason why proper communication was happening in the Foundry neighborhood to begin with.
I agree with you. And
so is that just still on her? Like, that's where my head starts to think like, oh, so that's just going to continue to be her responsibility on top of being city manager? What? No, that's not smart.
Well, I think in addition to actual choices, which they've given us a lot of evidence in that regard, body language is also a really important indicator of what people really think. And by attending the last city council meeting, my takeaway was, first of all, I mean, the seating was a little different. Not that that was their direction. I don't know who's responsible for that. But, both Adam Blowers and Sage were kind of up there, kind of flanking the mayor. And almost every question was directed to Adam. And it wasn't because content-wise, every question was a financial question. And let's just say, even if it was, in past meetings, every financial question would have been directed to Matt. It really belies what's going on that, of course, most of these council people will deny, but the evidence is overwhelming, right? Some of those guys don't like having a female city manager. And the way they're going to push back about that is to marginalize her and to marginalize her work. And because the ONI is something that she was part of building and implementing, that's the first thing they go after. I mean, they're not even smart about it. Like, it's not like, ooh, these wily dogs are, working their agenda to kind of push back on things they don't like. It's like, no, they're just putting it right out there, either because they're that bold or they aren't that smart. I'm not sure which, maybe both. I don't think it's bold. But anyway, it just is, it's frustrating to see because everyone else in the community is talking about this. Like, I went out to breakfast the other day and people were like, man, some of these guys don't seem to like Sage. What's their problem? And I said, well, I'm glad that you see that it's their problem and not hers. But yeah, I don't. It's troubling. It's definitely troubling because let me just go on the record and say Sage knows way more about how to effectively run a city government than most city councilors combined. So I think whether that's threatening to them or what, they really have an issue with her.
Well, and part of that could just be the sort of debate and discussion about was she really their choice, or was she really city council's choice? And was her hiring or appointment more of a reaction to what the community was voicing very clearly, that they weren't happy with the process, they weren't happy with the transparency of the process, they weren't happy with any of the things contributing to the city manager's search? So was that sort of a extending an olive branch? And the real intention was not to play out long term.
The thing is, they are not bold. So Sage was the community's choice. some of them, I mean, Sage was also the choice of many counselors. I don't mean to make it sound like she was not, but those of
voting for someone in a board meeting and actually being the person that you want to be holding that office, I think, are two different things. And I think
agree.
If I'm not holding any punches, that's worth just throwing in there.
Yes. No, I agree with you. And I think what we're seeing is the same people who are hostile to the community at large, and there are several counselors who don't hide the fact that they don't really care what anyone else has to say. They have this job and they're going to do what they want. Have that same attitude towards Sage because she is the community's choice. She is a stand-in for what the community has articulated as their values. And some of these guys just don't share those values because it challenges their individual authority. So I hope they can move past it. Maybe they'll all watch It's a Wonderful Life over the Christmas season, have a change of heart, and they can start off January 2019 saying, I'm going to take my job seriously and be the best city councilor that Geneva's ever seen.
I hope they were some of the folks from Geneva that I saw at the It's a Wonderful Life Festival a couple weeks ago here in Seneca Falls, because that was awesome. So let's talk about the multi-use town center that's being proposed in the town of Geneva at the corner of what is Preemption Road or County Road something or another, and 5 and 20.
Yeah. County Road 6, which is Preemption Road, and 5 and 20, the former driving range. Most people will know it as that, or the mini golf place. And I will say, by contrast, the town of Geneva has a well-oiled machine for a town board and town supervisor. That is going great. Mark Venuti is doing a great job, and he's got a great town board. I don't particularly like their big kickoff project. They did a comprehensive plan, which was a little ahead of Geneva's in terms of timing. And at the time, I went and spoke and explained that I didn't really like this project, and I haven't warmed up to it since. They are doing essentially a town center concept, which will be mixed-use development, residential and commercial retail, on that space. And I just think that it still is a sticking point for me that the reason people love Geneva is usually the lakefront, the library, the colleges, the proximity to the hospital, the ability, all of the Smith Opera House, the non-taxed services and amenities that are provided mostly by Geneva city residents. So I think it's a little cheeky for the town to potentially compete with or encroach on development that's going on in the city, things that the city is pursuing, by giving this just over the border opportunity where property taxes are lower. I mean, there's no town tax. They still have to pay county tax and school tax, which are the largest chunks, but still, it doesn't strike me as the most neighborly way to proceed, but I suppose I can't begrudge them acting in their own town interest. But I just feel like if we want to be one Geneva and we really want to see the region prosper, we shouldn't do things that are directly competitive.
I mean, my question to that would be, and I feel like I pretty thoroughly disagree with almost everything that was just thrown out there.
Okay.
Not to be,
No, that's good. What fun would it be if we always agreed? So I think you're right in terms of they're looking out for their own best interest, right? Like they're looking out for what would be a good idea for this corner, this otherwise nondescript corner. It's never going to be a driving range again. It's never going to be the mini golf hub that it was 10 years ago. And I just think multi-use tends to, or seems to be, the way every developer is going these days. You got that kind of proposal here in Seneca Falls for the former Huntington building. Or so that's one of the ideas being floated around: multi-use, multi-level, retail, residential, like all this. And if you aren't developing that, what are you developing? Is what I think about, because you got two options for that corner, effectively, in my mind. Some sort of straight up chain commercial space, which I think would be exponentially worse. Mm-hmm. We don't need another Tractor Supply on the straight across that corner. Yeah.
And this, by going this route, which I think is the other viable option, you at least give local residents the opportunity to sort of be involved and to actually like have some sort of direct connection to what ends up happening there. So, you know, I realize that it kind of, I can understand the city residents' concern about about that development and how it could take away. But I think the argument to it is going to be, whoa, hold on a second. Look at Geneva. Look at the Finger Lakes. There's plenty of commercial growth, and there's plenty of need for housing. We don't need to be fighting or arguing about something that's just over the border. Like there's enough to go around. And
yes, I don't mean to make it sound that it will. I did say it would be directly competitive, and I agree with that. I stand by that. But I don't mean to make it sound like if that's built, Geneva City doesn't get anything else. I'm just saying I don't get the we must do something there feeling, because let's look at that site in relation to all the things that attract people to Geneva. We do not have a well-functioning public transportation system that would allow the people moving into a place at the corner of County Road 4 and 5 and County Road 6 and 5 and 20 to go without a vehicle in a viable way. So we're talking about additional cars. We're talking about building housing that, I mean, I need to look more at the proposal to see what the actual income levels and kind of what the setup would be. But again, it's another enclave, I guess. And if we look at what would be sensible development practices, unless we feel we've really exhausted the centrally located stuff, I don't agree you should be developing on the periphery. But the town probably doesn't see it that way because it's not their periphery, it's the city's. And, you know, they probably think, well, you know, the city is its own entity. But I'm just saying that I think if we've learned nothing through all time, it's that cooperation and regional working together is in everybody's best interest. So I don't know. I just, you know, I feel like a mixed income development and mixed use development has been talked about downtown at the OEO site, about on some of those ridiculously huge parking lots that you could keep the parking but actually have usable space there. And that actually builds a sense of urban community. I think this is where the outsider's perspective jumps in. I think the city of Geneva is trying to move away from the commercial feeling, and I feel like the town is trying to embrace the commercial feeling because that section of 5 and 20 or Hamilton, whatever you want to call it, is effectively I don't want to call it the business district, but it's kind of like the commercial district where you have the chain stores, you got the gas stations, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. If that kind of relationship can work, not at the expense of one or the other, I think it's a great idea because then it does sort of keep the things that each wants in their own area. You know, the city of Geneva may not want, a mixed-use building that includes some of the things that might be interested in going on that very busy corner. Whereas the town of Geneva is saying, hey, this is perfect. We got the space. I do disagree with the idea that there's time to wait. And I don't want to use the word waste, but like that there's always this idea, well, why don't we wait? Well, why don't we wait? A lot of folks, and this is why I think the Seneca Falls development has been so polarizing around the Huntington building, is because here you have a buyer interested and you have another developer who in theory might be interested if the funding opportunities are right and if the logistics can play out. And you have folks who are in support of reusing a historic building saying, well, you as property owner should want to wait. You should want to wait. It's almost like saying now versus wait is as bad of a terrible of an argument as, you know, this thing versus that thing without considering all of the other options. But at the same time, it drives me crazy when people say, well, why don't we wait? People have been waiting around here for
I'm 28 years old. People have been waiting for 30 years for something good to happen. And for some folks, even with all of the good things that have happened in tourism and in local development, a lot of folks haven't felt a benefit from any of those areas and don't feel a benefit from any of those areas. Maybe they worked at one of the old industries that are gone. Maybe they had a job where the training and the skills they had then are just completely useless now. And those folks aren't feeling or reaping the benefits of a lot of the developments that have happened to this point. And that's the segment of the population, and it's a growing segment of the population, unfortunately, especially outside of the city of Geneva, where you don't have that. There's a lot of interest to live in the city of Geneva.
Definitely.
That's where those folks get really hung up on this idea of, well, we should turn this idea away, even though they're willing and they're here and they're at the table, because maybe we could do something better in like a year and a half or 2 years or 3 years. Because it just kind of, and there are so many more factors at play than just like an economic development arm to this. Like you talked about the housing aspect of it. Mm-hmm. That's huge. The livable, cost-effective places, the rental community is sort of, it's getting taller and not wider, right. I guess. Right. And, that's just, it is so hard for those folks to kind of just hear that and not hear that comes along with it. And I think the intent is there, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the people who are making the argument that maybe we should wait are also at the same time saying, well, we shouldn't just wait, but we should also sort of seek out additional ideas or some new approaches that maybe aren't being worked on right now. Yeah. That was a little bit of a rant, and I apologize.
No, I think it was good. I think you raised a lot of good points, some of which I think apply to the Geneva situation, some of which I think are more specific to the Seneca Falls situation. So I don't want to cloud the two, but I would say in regard to the Seneca Falls issue, I can hear what you're saying, but I do think there's a difference. I always caution my kids, it is not the case that something is always better than nothing, because hasty decisions are not usually the best decisions. And in a community like Seneca Falls, which I think kind of has some of the same issues that Geneva had and I think is growing out of, thankfully, I think Seneca Falls, for all the reasons you just mentioned about industry going away and people not reaping the benefits of some of the early reinvestments, I think it ends up being like this middle school girl syndrome where the shy wallflower who has low self-esteem may kind of jump at the first opportunity that presents itself, whether or not that is in her best interest. And I think that I just worry that some of these communities around here, when they accept things like landfills, incinerators, fracking waste, which I'm not saying we're doing right now, but the things that have come to the fore over the years. I think people, corporations, developers sometimes know how to manipulate and take advantage of a community with low self-esteem. And I would just say, I agree that doing nothing is not the preferred mode of policymaking.
And it doesn't sound like you're saying nothing.
Right.
Like you're not saying nothing. You're saying just not this thing and we go after 7 or 10 other things.
Right. I just say, your community needs some standards, and once you've developed what they are, don't jump into something that doesn't meet those. And,
I think for the tying back to what we were talking about with the city and the town in Geneva, maybe there just needs to be more communication. I'm not really sure what that sort of relationship has been like historically over the last 5 or 10 years maybe. But it sounds like something that could probably be resolved with a little more communication. Maybe some sort of agreement to terms that, one entity isn't going to punish the other. Because who knows, maybe, you have to look at it from the town's perspective. Maybe the town is saying, oh, wait a second, the city's doing all this stuff. The city is getting all this money from the state, and they're developing the lakefront. They're developing, holy crap, we're gonna get gutted here.
Right.
And, it is sort of that survival instinct, I guess, that might kick in, and people sort of jump into gear and say, all right, well, we're doing this development, whether they were the first or last ones that presented. Let's we were sort of running.
We're almost out of time. This is
We're
crazy.
It's crazy. So let's talk a little more about that issue in Seneca Falls, the Huntington building. Earlier this week, I was on Evan Dawson's Connections, WXXI in Rochester and in Geneva. Talked with the Landmark Society folks again, sort of had this debate about economic development versus historic preservation. I was the only, my column that ran over the summer in the Finger Lakes Times was sort of the starting point for the whole discussion and debate around food insecurity in Seneca County, especially in North Seneca, not just because of, the potential that, a Tops could close and really put the town of Seneca Falls and Waterloo in a bad spot on the food side, but just in terms of this is another one of those issues where the debate about whether a large convenience store would be a service to the community in the same way that a mixed use combining residential and maybe food service or a couple other things in the structure that exists now is mostly, in my mind, it's trying to be contained within this very narrow scope of it's either economic development or historic preservation. But it's one of these issues where you have so many different issues at play. Transportation is a huge problem in this county. It's a huge problem in the northern part of the county, despite the fact that it is the most developed part of the county. Housing is a huge problem. And, anytime you hear about housing in or rental properties or units inside of a historic building, oftentimes the assumption is, whether it's right or wrong, that those units are going to be expensive. It's not going to be sort of what the community needs, which is more affordable housing. And I was super grateful that Evan Dawson even entertained the conversation, but that I tried to just sort of drive home that my position in all of the things that I've written about this topic is not to be anti-preservation, but just realistic in terms of what the county really needs, what the town really needs. And if the town and or community organizations and or government entities, municipal entities, aren't going to do something to address these other issues, these other outstanding issues, food insecurity, transportation, housing, et cetera, when private businesses come in and say, hey, we have a proposal to do this, and it may in any way, shape, or form help that problem, you cannot just walk away from them and say, nope, sorry, not even going to consider it because this, and this. And I get the desire, that ideal sort of view that if we look into the future and we say, what do we want to see? There is a very idealistic view of what Seneca Falls or communities like it will look like. And maintaining that historic sort of look is important. But at the same time, you have these very realistic problems that you just can't ignore. And they are being ignored. And I start to wonder, and maybe this was why I wrote that column to begin with, I genuinely am not sure that the folks who are currently involved with town and county government are even capable of addressing these issues. I don't think they are, and I'm not sure they ever would be. So that's why I push back against the idea that, a convenience store is just a convenience store. It's nonsense. It's a really like black and white way to look at a super gray issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a lot more to add. We talked about this a few months ago on here, and I guess I would just say that I agree with you that the issue is complex, and I agree with you that it shouldn't just be no, outright, we're not talking to you. But I would also like to push back against the idea that communities must respond to a developer's proposal as proposed, and that somehow saying no to them is an insult, or I'm not saying you said this, but in these discussions, they're not going to take it personally. They have got numbers telling them why they want to be there. You have a community telling you what they want their community to look like. There are plenty of historic communities around the country that have been able to make commercial operations work within the existing stock. But it requires a strong committed town board or governing body that's able to say, hey, we welcome your operation within these parameters, and we're going to help find a way to make that work. You don't have that here. Right now, you have got a town, and a lot of this region operates this way, in such a polarized way that they cannot have a complex, nuanced, responsible discussion. And that came out during your appearance on Connections, which I listened to on WEOS. When at the kind of the end of the discussion, the conclusion was that what makes this issue so difficult for Seneca Falls is the lack of governance, good governance, because you need people in the lead to steer a community through this discussion. And right now, it's like arbitrary, haphazard. No one can figure out what's going on. You got people suing other people. Like, it just doesn't, it's not the way a community should handle economic development. So that's all I've got to say about that.
And I think it's interesting because one of the things that, one of the questions that Evan asked during that conversation was, if it were put up to a vote, what do you think the community would really want? And I think it's interesting. One of the things that really frustrates me in local government is the lack of involvement and how you sort of tend to have the same 10, 15, 20, 30 people involved in every process and involved in every decision, involved in every whatever. And, the assumption that, preserving that building is actually, if it's put up to a vote, is decisively what the community would want. I'm not sure that's so clear. I'm not sure that's crystal clear. We live in a very commercialized world that relies on how quickly you can get from point A to B, and there isn't a lot of, taking in the scenery and just enjoying it. That's kind of where there isn't really a good way right now in government, and maybe this is a topic that we can talk more about in another episode, is just there doesn't really seem to be a good method to get the pulse of a community anymore. Elected folks tend to represent whatever party has greater control in any given community, more times than not. Obviously, you have some grassroots movements happening, but and the turnaround is, how do those folks represent the community at large, and how do you represent the 70% of the community that just doesn't get involved in politics at all?
I think that's a great point, and I think that's probably where we're going to end up going in this conversation with Leslie Danks Burke, because in local government, when people aren't participating, that is not a failing of the residents. That is a failing of the government agents, the legislators, to communicate to the public why any of this matters. Yeah. And the fact that they are unable to make their jobs and decisions seem important to people is terrible, because they want it that way, because then no one will ask any questions, right? So it's not in a legislator's best interest, a legislator who just wants to get reelected all the time, to actually go to people and say, here's what's at stake. Here's how it's going to impact you. We could try this or we could try that. Which of those two, how do you weigh those? What sounds good? That takes time, takes knowledge, takes energy, and it takes responsibility. And right now, I think we're seeing a real crisis in some local governments where people are talking to each other in the governing body about themselves, their personal beliefs, and they cannot communicate effectively to the public.
Yeah, the communication piece is huge. One of the things that still sort of blows my mind at this point is the fact that, obviously we had that conversation on Connections earlier this week, and then before that, late in October or early in November, I had the folks from the Landmark Society, Larry Francer and Caitlin Maivas, on my show.
Right.
And those were the only two times that I have publicly seen or heard or even included the prospect of a second developer.
Right.
for this kind of public debate to happen about a property and for the public not to know that there was even a second party interested. Right. And I have been making this argument all along, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the program or not, but it was like, if they just said right off the bat, hey, we have 5 other developers who are interested in potentially developing this property, say make the ideal argument that the community was literally 50-50 on this, half for, half against, I think you would have axed half of the people who were against it, against the prospect of saving the building. And it would have been a 75-25 discussion because they would have known, communicate.
Right.
That's it.
Well, and that's why I think people who don't want anyone looking over their shoulder when they're governing vilify the press, because here you are getting information, bringing it to people about the full story of what's going on. You know, newspapers are doing the same thing. I mean, they're not, you are providing a service. I don't mean to say they're doing the exact same thing, but the role of the press is to get information that's in the public interest. And the fact that, you've got these closed-door meetings. You've got people either refusing to talk to the newspaper or saying things that are not constructive, characterizing things as stupid, and not being willing to actually engage in a discussion, shows a disrespect to the public. And I don't understand how people are sitting back and not feeling outraged about that.
Yeah, I agree. And just like that, we're out of time. That's it. We motored through an hour and there were so many other things we're going to have to talk about on our upcoming episodes. Obviously, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for making 2018 really a groundbreaking one for this particular podcast, and that we've been able to move it into a weekly program. Obviously, Jackie, grateful to you for making yourself available for it and always being willing to talk about these things, because that also isn't always easy. Appreciate you.
Oh, well, likewise. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
So we will be back next week, and then we will be back in 3 weeks, Jackie and I, with Leslie Danksberg, having a really interesting conversation about government. Until then, stay informed, keep listening, and have a conversation while you're at it. Happy Christmas, Happy New Year, all that stuff. See you next time.